Weather is the most ordinary explanation for most things that go wrong in wilderness areas. This is appropriate. Weather kills people outdoors more reliably than almost any other cause. It arrives faster than forecasts predict, it escalates faster than experience prepares you for, and it finds the gaps in preparation that seemed adequate an hour earlier. Lightning, hypothermia, flash floods in terrain that looked dry, the specific danger of high-altitude weather in the afternoon, the thermal buildup, the rapid cloud formation, the sudden electrical activity on exposed ridgelines is documented in every wilderness safety manual and still kills experienced backcountry travelers every season. So, when a search and rescue coordinator notes unusual weather in connection with the disappearance case, the first assumption is that the weather is the explanation, that a person went missing because the weather caught them, overwhelmed them, produced a situation their skill and preparation couldn't manage. This assumption is correct in most cases. It is not correct in all of them. There is a subset of documented disappearance cases, not large, not the majority, but consistent enough across the record to constitute a pattern, where the weather that appeared in connection with the disappearance cannot be accounted for by the forecast, and where the weather itself behaved in ways that experienced meteorologists and SAR personnel describe as outside what they would expect from the conditions present. Not severe weather that wasn't forecast, unusual weather, weather with specific characteristics that do not correspond to the standard meteorological processes that produce weather in that terrain. This episode examines that subset, not to claim that the weather is a cause, to document the pattern and sit with what it suggests. A search coordinator who worked Cascade Range rescues for 14 years kept a personal log of her cases that went beyond the formal documentation requirements, not because she was told to, because she found that the formal documentation didn't have room for the observations that sometimes mattered most to her. The qualitative features of the environment during specific cases, the things that she noticed but couldn't easily reduce to the categories a report required. The texture of the situation, the quality of the air and the light, and the specific character of each operation in a way that the timeline and the resource deployment and the recovery data didn't capture. In this personal log, she noted weather anomalies in connection with specific cases, not all of them. In most cases, the weather was straightforward. Either it was what the forecast said, or it was a reasonable deviation from the forecast that experienced field workers expected and managed. But in a subset of her cases, she noted something different. She used a specific phrase repeatedly across multiple entries spanning several years. The weather came first. By this she meant that the unusual weather conditions she was noting appeared before the disappearance event, not as a consequence of an unfolding situation, not as the context in which an accident occurred, but as a precursor, as something that arrived before anything else happened. She said this to the researcher with an awareness of how it sounded. She said, "I know what it implies. I'm not sure I believe the implication. I'm just telling you what I noticed." She said, "The weather came first, and then something happened that I couldn't fully explain. And I started noting it because I noticed it more than once." The specific weather phenomena she had noted fell into several categories. Fog, not the ordinary valley fog that fills drainages in the early morning and burns off by mid-morning, which is a standard feature of many Western wilderness landscapes. Localized fog, fog that appeared in a specific area without the temperature inversion conditions that produce ordinary valley fog, that persisted beyond the point when it should have dissipated, and that appeared at elevations where fog formation was not meteorologically expected given the conditions. Sudden temperature drops, not the temperature fluctuations of normal mountain weather, which are significant and well documented. Drops that occurred in the absence of the air mass movement that normally produces them. Drops that were localized, that personnel moving out of a specific area reported leaving behind, as if the temperature drop was associated with a specific location rather than a regional weather system. Electrical phenomena. The specific sensory experience of electrical charge in the air, the tingling in the skin, the smell of ozone, the behavior of metal objects that precedes lightning. Present in conditions where no lightning activity was occurring and where the atmospheric conditions, according to subsequent meteorological review, should not have produced those sensations. And silence. She listed this as a weather phenomenon, which she acknowledged was unusual. She said, "I know silence isn't weather, but it felt like weather to me. It arrived the same way weather arrives, as a change in the environmental conditions, and in the cases where it appeared alongside the other things I was noting. The silence that this series has been documenting since its first episode. The total environmental quiet that witnesses across multiple cases have described as arriving before something happens. She had noticed it too, from the outside, from the perspective of a search coordinator working the terrain in the hours after the disappearance, not during it. She had walked into that specific silence in areas connected to her most difficult cases. She said, it was unmistakable, the same quality every time, not comfortable quiet, not the peaceful quiet of a good day in the mountains. Something else, something you felt in your chest before you could identify what you were hearing or not hearing. She said, when I walked into it, I always felt like I had arrived somewhere that was already in the middle of something, not that I was the one arriving at the scene, that the scene had already been there, and I was the latecomer. The meteorological record for several of the documented cases in the broader research supports her observations in specific, if limited, ways. Weather data for wilderness areas is sparse. There are no weather stations on most ridgelines. The data that exists comes from valley stations and airport weather observations, supplemented by radar and satellite imagery. For specific locations in specific terrain at specific times, the meteorological record often has significant gaps, but in several cases, where the surrounding data was adequate for analysis, the weather conditions that search coordinators noted in the field did not correspond to what the broader meteorological picture would have predicted. A case in the Northern Rockies, a search coordinator noted localized fog at 7,200 feet elevation in late July, persisting through the mid-morning hours in conditions that the surrounding weather data indicated should not have produced fog at that elevation. The fog was confined to a specific drainage. Teams working adjacent drainages at the same elevation reported clear conditions. A case in the Oregon Cascades, several SAR personnel independently noted what one described as an electrical feeling in the air in the area surrounding the last known position of a missing hiker. The nearest weather station recorded no lightning activity for that day. The regional radar showed no storm cells within 50 miles. The reports of the electrical sensation came from people who were in the terrain at different times during the search, not simultaneously, not from people who had compared notes. A case in the Appalachians. The search coordinator, who would later keep the informal list of anomalous locations in her county, noted in her personal log a temperature drop that she estimated at 10 degrees Fahrenheit over the course of approximately 15 minutes in a specific section of trail. She was there with 2 team members. All 3 of them noted the temperature change. The weather forecast for that day showed no frontal system, no significant pressure change, no meteorological mechanism that would produce that kind of localized temperature drop. The weather in these cases was doing something that weather doesn't do, or that weather doesn't do unless there is something producing it. The question, what was producing it, is the one that the documentation raises without answering. The relationship between unusual atmospheric phenomena and disappearance events is not a new observation. It appears in historical accounts from a range of wilderness areas, not as paranormal speculation, but as field observation by experienced outdoors people who documented what they saw without necessarily knowing what it meant. Trappers and mountain men of the 19th century occasionally noted unusual atmospheric conditions in association with areas they learned to avoid, not because they believed in the supernatural, but because they had learned empirically that certain terrain features produced experiences they didn't want. The indigenous communities across the Western Ranges had their own frameworks for this. The specific relationship between weather phenomena and what the traditions called the behavior of specific places is encoded in multiple independent traditions, often with a precision that suggests it came from sustained observation rather than from mythological narrative. The fog that arrives at specific elevations in specific terrain, the electrical quality of the air in specific places, the silence that precedes specific kinds of experience. These traditions did not separate the meteorological from the spiritual in the way that Western frameworks do. The weather was not simply atmospheric physics. It was part of the character of a place, an expression of what a place was and what it was doing. A retired ranger who had worked closely with tribal communities in the Pacific Northwest for 20 years said in a conversation that the researcher requested specifically about weather and disappearances. The elders I worked with would not have found this question surprising. They would not have found it strange that the air changes before certain things happen in certain places. They would have said, "Of course it does. The place announces itself," she said. They had specific language for the different ways a place announces itself, what the air does, what the light does, what the animals do, what the silence does. They had been paying attention to these things for generations, and they had built a very detailed vocabulary for them. She said, and the vocabulary included specific guidance about what to do when you notice those signs, how to respond, whether to continue into the terrain, or to wait, or to turn back. She said, the guidance wasn't arbitrary, it was practical. It was the result of generations of learning what happened when you followed the signs and what happened when you ignored them. The researcher asked, what happened when people ignored them? The ranger was quiet for a moment. She said, sometimes nothing. The place announces itself, and you walk in, and everything is fine. She said, and sometimes you don't come back. The search coordinator, who kept the personal weather log, eventually shared her observations with a meteorologist she trusted, someone outside the SAR community, who she thought might be able to offer a framework for what she had been noting. The meteorologist reviewed her descriptions carefully. She asked questions about the specific features, the elevation, the terrain configuration, the time of year, the surrounding atmospheric conditions for each case. After several conversations, she offered a partial explanation for some of what the coordinator had observed. Localized fog at unexpected elevations can sometimes be produced by cold air pooling in specific terrain features. Drainages and bowl-shaped depressions that trap cold air in ways that the surrounding topography doesn't. The fog in the specific drainage case was consistent with this, she said, though the persistence was longer than she would have expected. The electrical sensation in the absence of lightning is harder to explain, she said. She described a mechanism involving piezoelectric rock that generates electrical fields under mechanical stress, including the kind of stress produced by the tectonic forces that shape mountain terrain. In areas of geological complexity, she said, this mechanism could theoretically produce atmospheric electrical effects without the storm activity that normally generates them. She had not encountered this in her professional work. She was aware of the research. She said it was theoretically consistent, but that she had no empirical data from the specific terrain types in question. The temperature drops she could not explain with any mechanism she was confident in. She said, localized temperature drops of that magnitude in those conditions are outside what I would predict from standard atmospheric physics. I'm not saying they didn't happen. I'm saying I don't have a good model for what produced them. She said, there are things that happen in specific terrain that we don't have good models for. That's a legitimate observation, not a mystery. She said, what I can tell you is that the specific terrain features that appear in your notes, the drainages, the geological complexity, the elevation bands, are the terrain features that produce the most unpredictable, localized atmospheric conditions. Whether there's a connection between that unpredictability and what you're observing in your cases, I can't say, she said, but I wouldn't dismiss it. There is a case from the Colorado Rockies, summer of 2003, that the search coordinator included in her personal log with more detail than most entries. A pair of experienced climbers had set out to summit a 14,000-foot peak via a standard route. They were well prepared. They had checked the forecast, clear through midday, building afternoon thunderstorms as expected, a standard Colorado summer pattern. They planned to summit by 10 a.m. and be below tree line before the afternoon build-up. They did not summit by 10 a.m. At 10:30, the guide who had stayed at base camp attempted radio contact. No response. At 11, he attempted again. Nothing. He hiked up the approach trail to the point where he could see the upper mountain. He later told the search coordinator that the upper mountain was clear. No clouds on the peak. The afternoon build-up was still 2 or 3 hours away at minimum. The visibility was unlimited, and there was fog on the middle section of the route. Not the summit, not the approach. The middle section, a talus field at approximately 12,500 feet, that the climbers should have passed through hours earlier. Localized fog, dense enough to eliminate visibility, in conditions where fog at that elevation should not have existed. He stood and watched it for a few minutes. The fog did not move. It did not thin. It sat in the talus field, the way fog sits in a valley on a cold morning, without any of the meteorological reasons a valley has that make that ordinary. Then it cleared. Not gradually, it cleared the way a held breath releases, completely, all at once. The upper mountain was empty. Both climbers were found the following morning. One had descended on his own, emerging from the lower approach with no clear memory of the preceding 18 hours. He was confused and dehydrated and did not know what had happened to his partner. His partner was found 3 days later, alive, in a drainage on the opposite side of the peak from where they had been climbing. He was in good physical condition. He had no memory of crossing the ridgeline to the drainage. He did not know how much time had passed. Neither man could account for the time between leaving the talus field in the morning and being found. The search coordinator noted the fog in her log. She noted the time it appeared before the SAR operation, before the climbers had been reported missing, before anyone knew there was a problem. She noted that the guide had watched it clear completely and that the mountain had been empty when it did. She wrote, "The fog was first. It was there before we knew anything was wrong." She underlined this once. She did not know what to do with it except write it down. So she wrote it down and carried it with her, as people in this work carry the things they cannot file away. The silence deserves its own attention. Of all the weather-adjacent phenomena that appear in the documentation of disappearance cases, the silence is the most consistent and the most difficult to account for meteorologically. Wind dies, insects stop, birds quiet, a total cessation of the ambient acoustic texture of a wilderness environment, not gradual. Witnesses describe it as immediate, as a threshold crossed rather than a fade. It has been described by witnesses across this series. The man at mile marker 2.3, the children who followed something, the hunters in Wyoming, the hikers in the Appalachians. It has been described by SAR personnel who worked the aftermath of these cases, walking into terrain where it was already present. It has been described across decades of documented cases by people who had no knowledge of each other and no framework for what they were describing. It is not the silence of an empty landscape. Experienced outdoor people know empty landscape silence, the quality of sound in truly uninhabited terrain where human presence is absent. This is different. This is a silence that witnesses consistently describe as active, present, as if something is listening rather than nothing is making noise. A sound recordist who worked in wilderness documentary production for 15 years and who had been in remote terrain across multiple continents said, "When the researcher described this category of silence, I know exactly what you're describing." She said, "I've been in that silence twice in 2 different places in the American West, once in the Sierra Nevada and once in the Southern Cascades." She said, "It's unlike any other acoustic environment I've worked in, and I've worked in some very quiet places, deep cave systems, remote Antarctic terrain, places with essentially no ambient sound at all. This is different. Those quiet places feel empty. This feels full." She said, "The best description I have for it is, everything that makes a sound has decided not to." She said, not couldn't, decided not to. She said, I've thought a lot about that distinction. She said, I don't know what makes it, but it's real, it's distinctive, and both times I've encountered it, I left the area immediately, not because I was afraid, because it felt like the right thing to do. She said, the terrain was asking for a decision, and I decided to leave. The coordinator who kept the personal weather log is retired now. She lives in a valley below the mountains she worked in for 14 years. She still walks in the hills near her house, but not in the high terrain. She says, this is partly age and partly preference, and partly something she doesn't fully articulate. She still has the log. She still adds to it occasionally. Notes from conversations with former colleagues, observations from case records she continues to follow out of professional habit. She said, I've been trying for years to find the language that would allow someone to look at what I've documented and take it seriously without either dismissing it as anecdote or jumping to conclusions it doesn't support. She said, I haven't found that language yet, but I think it exists. She said, the patterns are real. I know they're real because I lived them. The weather that came first, the silence that arrived before, the terrain that announced itself in specific ways before something happened in it. She said, I don't know what was producing it. I don't know what the something was. She said, I just know it wasn't random. She said, and I know that the cases where I noticed these things were the cases that stayed with me, that I still think about, that I haven't been able to file away as completed. She said, they're still open for me, even the ones with closed files, they're still open. She said this simply, not with sadness, with the specific quality of someone who has accepted that some questions remain open and who has found a way to be present with that. The mountains were visible through her window as she spoke. The same mountain she had worked in for 14 years. She did not look at them while she was talking. She looked at them after, for a long time, without saying anything. The way you look at something that has given you more than you asked for, and that is still giving, quietly, in the specific way that places that announce themselves continue to announce themselves, even from a distance, even when you have left, even when you have filed the cases closed and carried what you couldn't file. Somewhere else, where the mountains can still be seen from the window, and the silence sometimes still arrives before anything else does. The next episode in this series returns to the dogs. Not the behavior of dogs in individual cases that has been examined in detail in EP05. This episode looks at the pattern across cases, at what happens when you take all of the documented instances of tracking dogs stopping at specific terrain features and lay them on a map. The pattern that emerges from that mapping is the one that has been building beneath the surface of this series since the first episode. A shape that the individual cases suggested but did not fully reveal. A shape that becomes visible only when you look at all of them at once. The investigation continues into the map, into what the map shows when you mark every place where the dogs stopped and refused to go further, into what it means that those places have things in common that no conventional explanation has yet accounted for.